So welcome everybody to the talk this afternoon on this Saturday in May. And this I think is the last weekend here in Oz anyway, where we're in this state of emergency. I know we're going to get more information on Monday. I think the only other people here are from New Zealand, so I don't exactly know what's happening over there for you guys now. But I think you're probably in a similar position. Maybe you're a little bit ahead of us. So this talk on two streams, speaking about what we could say an integral vision of practice, where we're bringing the totality of ourself into fruition, the possibility of this, the multitudes of ourself, and at the same time, finding our anchoring in a deeper resource for our being that tunnels far down. Sometimes I think of practice in this sense. It's like you're walking along, and you're starting to feel some more ease in your life, and you're moving through, and then there's some other baby further down the back of the road that starts kind of like howling or like screaming, or then there's another baby a bit further back that's just like playing with the butterflies or looking around, and you sort of stopped again. You go, oh shit, and you have to go back and kind of collect and come into a relationship with this aspect and sort of bring it along with you. And just a poetic image of this. So in a sense, there's something in this way of growing that's slow. I mean, sometimes very quick, but there's also there's a patience and a slowness in the movement. This an idea of an integral practice came really alive in India by a man that some of you might know called Aurobindo. And he was also someone who inspired some of Ken Wilber's thinking, who's a philosopher in Boulder, who speaks a lot about this integral approach, about all the different maps of human development and the value that they each have in coming into this whole. So Aurobindo was interesting, and he has an ashram in Pondicherry, which is down like near Chennai, so that's South India. And he was originally, when the British rule was in there, he was a really mad activist, like very intense about wanting to get the independence of India back. And he was an activist for quite a long time, around that time of Nehru and a little bit before Gandhi was around. And then at some point he went to prison, and then in prison he sort of realized that there was this inner work to happen as well as this outer work. And he came upon something, and then he opened up this whole sort of center with another woman. Somehow he came in contact with this French woman who had been an artist, but they came together and did this deep work there in India, and you can still go there. And they grow the most amazing, this is a little bit of beside the point, but they grow the most amazing flowers in this place. I've never seen more beautiful roses in this place. But what was amazing is that in India there was still a bit of that idea of that the deeper practice happens on the mountaintop, that it happens away from life. That we're exiting into this holy other sort of nirvanic place, and like we'll hang out in this life until we get there. And that idea can also be quite a good political maneuvering to keep people into into the inequity or a particular social position they're in that isn't that great, with this idea that this other life. But Aurobindo was like, no, we need to change things in the here and now. There needs to be an examination of internal suffering, but also external suffering, and that our outer life, that the world is just as important as growing this inner life. So with this woman, Ma, they were making schools and education. A lot of the practitioners there were writing poetry. They were sort of deepening into a very deep well of practice, into some kind of source, but at the same time, they were exploring their artistry and their uniqueness. And yeah, they're pretty amazing work. And hearing their discourses around politics and what was happening with Hitler at the time, and they were really tracking. It was quite fascinating. Anyway, so one of his lines, which is my point, Aurobindo's lines with this integral vision that our deeper practice has to come into education and politics and everywhere. His line was, our practice is like a slow, supple, sinuousy, all-compassing affair where our light has to touch all corners of our experience. And this was also the beautiful Bengali writer who also grew up in Calcutta, which is the same as Aurobindo. He said something. He was also a man who was deep in his spiritual practice, but was also a poet and created a whole school of arts to keep going the culture of India that had been really, sort of put down or trivialized by the English. He was like, no, we're bringing this all back through. We're going to bring our unique culture, our distinct culture, into fruition again. And he said, one of his lines that was also quite strong for me is that the divine, or the depth of us, wants to make love to the world through our own uniqueness. So again, this dance between this depth and this wholeness, and then something very particular. And so as I sort of mentioned at the beginning, as householders and practicing as householders, we're not monks and nuns that would be in these walled kind of places and practicing really deeply and saying, taking away a lot of these distractions, no sex, no money, no choice around what I'm going to wear, putting all that aside to really get to the goal. There's this sense of saying all of these no's to get to this yes. But for us, it's kind of different as householders, where there is so much to come into relationship with. And I think that this is exciting and interesting. And that after we sort of engage in the foundations of practice and finding our ground and a deeper sense of who we are, the tantric tradition puts forward, and this is tracked more in the Tibetan tradition, so in the insight tradition that I've sort of been authorized to teach, and that's more of the foundations, but I've also practiced in the Tibetan, and that extends us into something called the tantric tradition, where there's an idea of sky weaving, where we're weaving our depth of understanding into all aspects of life. So what maybe in the foundational traditions they say no, and then in the tantric tradition we re-enter life and we say yes, but we're relating with these things differently, more openly, less gripping to find our sense of self-worth, in these particular objects of our life, so with more freedom. And so what I'll be talking to in this talk, these two contributions, these two streams of, as I'm saying again, just to reiterate, of psychological development, and then of this more spiritual or dharmic development. And, as mentioning that all these things we come into relationship with, there's these wisdom traditions, the Buddhist tradition and other wisdom traditions, and then there's so many different psychological contribution traditions. So I won't be tracking all of them, mostly, just the psychological as I've understood it, and then the Dharma. But also talking about now, like as householders and modern beings, I think our relationship to the environment is so important. And I know in this, there's so many that I'm not going to talk about now, but and I don't know as much about, but have great regard for the indigenous traditions, the bodies of knowledge there that are a part of this integral vision of all of the knowledge we have in the world to help us in these times. And I think about the fires that we had here in Australia at the beginning of the year, which was, as we know, was so devastating, so much loss of wildlife and animals, and so many people losing their homes. And I do not understand why that our leaders here in Australia are not getting on very humble ground. So this makes me feel, and speaking to Indigenous elders here who have such astonishing knowledge about how to care for this country and how to care and protect from fire. And there are old people who would have just been watching those fires, shaking their heads, you know. Why were people not speaking to us like ancient, elegant methods to know how to care for country? So that is a whole nother inquiry and conversation that I'm not going to be speaking to now, but just to acknowledge that that's very much part of, I think, what knowledge is needed to steer us as a global community more safely through these times. We can't cover everything at once. So yeah, so I, as has just been mentioned, I've had this long relationship with my meditation practice and the Dharma. And equally, I mentioned being 17 and having that sort of, how I call it, metamorphic burn, disruption in my own being that was sprouting these fresh seeds of what I wanted to pursue in my life. And at that time, I actually was engaging too in some Jungian analysis and was also writing profusely. And then, you know, in later years, I would return to that actually more in a Freudian situation, but with a woman with a very, very deep heart that sort of her method was a bit beyond just a contained one-way method. And that has just served me so profoundly. So this is where I'm just coming from to give this talk. And so I wanted to just track a little bit, as I mentioned at the beginning, these two different inheritances that we have, and one being this very personal inheritance that we come into this life with, that it's sort of random. It's a bit of a lottery ticket. I don't know why someone ends up being born here, someone else there, someone's born a man, someone's born a woman, someone's born into privilege, someone's born into, you know, a really underprivileged environment, but this is what happens. But so first I wanted to speak a little bit more about this more transcendent inheritance, so more this Dharmic movement. Okay, just checking in, is everybody hearing me and we're all together so far in the conversation? You with me? Cool. So it's just bizarre talking to you when I can't feel you, when you're not here with me. Okay, you there? Cool. On I go. Thumbs up. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, here we go. So this transcendent inheritance, where we could call it not so much a clarifying of our identity, a sort of growing our ego into more health, you know, knowing our boundaries, being able to speak up, having some sense of what we're feeling, knowing where we come from, you know, having some connection to our ancestry. You know, all of that very important aspects of our identity. But now speaking more of the Dharma around this process of almost widening our identity to include more and more. Which points to that there is something in us that can outshine and can outgrow certain conditionings we have. That we can, there's this possibility of bursting through, for one and all, the Buddha puts forward, for one and all, certain constraints in our mind, or certain states of mind that have held us captive, that have diminished us, that there is the possibility of opening this up through practice, of outshining this. That this is possible. And that there is a way to meet whatever is happening in us, a way to not turn away from our suffering, but to eyeball it with this deeper ground in us for these foundational practices, to see and to behold and to in time let go and to feel a freer sense of being. That we can see that this impermanence to what moves through us. And that in time, certain states of mind that once really hijacked our attention, through as we sit and we start to be able to have the ground to hold them, can start to move through. And that we can, relate to our past, to our baggage, we could say, in a way that ultimately can be freeing. So it sense that the Dharma points to this idea that no matter what dark night we may have had, that there is the capacity for the sun to rise again, for the sun of our nature to burst on through. That this is possible, that no experience is a full stop. And this is, I think, a contribution that the Buddha gives, that in our deeper ground there is this profound okayness, almost like a birthright for this deep okayness that we can feel as a human being, but that it needs certain conditions for this to be supported. A certain community, a certain view on us, maybe in hard times, that can say, hey, this isn't a full stop. There's more to you than meets the eye. And it's interesting that when the Buddha experienced this, when something bursts through our sort of conditioning, when he woke up under a peepal tree, it wasn't a banyan tree, but it was a similar family to the fig tree, and he woke up under this tree that night. And on that night, it said that he went through 4 watches, 4 sort of phases of his waking up that night, where the first night he saw everything that he'd been in the past. And from this perspective, it was like lifetimes. I feel like there's enough just to work with this one life. He saw all the moments when he had been really contracted, all of the moments where he'd been in some fixed identity and he'd been caught up or hung up. And he felt them all really deeply. There was a sense of this quite astonishing emotional openness to everything that he'd been in the past, and the backlog of his own experience, that he had to feel it all. So it wasn't just like he was sort of transcending and out of it. He had to go deeply into all of everything that he'd been before in the past and wake it up to free it. And then he started to see in that there's not some fixed identity of who I am. It's something so much more fluid. And then he also saw all around the world. It said that he saw all of the suffering that was happening, all of the contractions, all the different people in these moments of ignorance, or when they were hard up and pressed into their pain, or when they were acting out of ignorance and causing harm to others. And he just saw this whole human strife of these dark states that we can get into. And it said that in that, his heart kind of burst open, and that something in him really started unknotting and unbinding in his identity. He was very, very wide. And what he sort of saw is so much, what one major obstacle, he would say, to opening is how tightly we want to hold on to our identity, to know where we stand. Something about how tight we want to have my own particular territory. This is who I am. He said that the problem is that human beings can delight in getting stuck, and that they do not want to not hold on to their own place. It's like that. We could even just think our resistance to change, or to, of course, like the deep truth of death, and how much that can bring up in us, that this wanting to hold on to where we are right now, and this willingness to actually let go is part of the support in the path. Bit of a pause there. So it's that sense that cool. Okay. So yeah, so this wider identity, and that, as I said, that it's this, in this spiritual inheritance, there's this possibility of being able to transcend certain aspects of our own life. Okay, and so then Ken Wilber, he would say in this, that what the Buddha saw that night is something how we can all become victims of a case of mistaken identity, that we're fixating on ourselves or gripping on it to ourselves in a particular way and not knowing our deeper ground. And so he says that we become victims in this case of a mistaken identity, and our supreme, our unbounded identity is waiting quietly but surely for our discovery. So I'll just say that again. We become victims of this mistaken identity, clinging onto these identities, and at the deeper ground of our being is waiting. What he calls it, this supreme unbound identity, is waiting quietly but surely our discovery of it. And that this part of us wants nothing more than to call us home, to call us back into our ground. And to who we are, he would say, beneath or under or prior to our sort of conditioned self. And in the Zen tradition, you'll sometimes have the question, who are you before you were given a name? Who are you before you were given a name? Who are you when everything is stripped back? And I think it's interesting that then the writer Aldous Huxley, so I'm pulling in a few influences into this talk, the writer Aldous Huxley, he looked at the Buddhist tradition, speaking about this more transcendental growth, and then he looked at all these other traditions. He called them the sort of wisdom traditions, and he tried to bring together some really distinct points that they all said, that all of these bodies of knowledge sort of came up with four main points around having a relationship to the deeper ground in ourselves. And so I just wanted to share them with you to give a bit more context around this waking up aspect. So Huxley, he was actually born at a similar time as Aurobindo and as Tagore in India, but over on the other side of the world. And so these 4 points that he said that he found in all the traditions, the first one was that we are all, that we're all interwoven or held within something larger than our individual selves, that each of our own identities is held within a wider brace of connectivity. And that we all are part of something deeper, and that there were different names in the different traditions to point to this. If that was the light of the unity of Allah, or the Christian tradition, the more mystical side, like the kingdom of heaven within, or in the Dharma tradition, the unconditioned or the unborn, or like the Zen, like who you were before you had your own name, or Buddha nature, or sometimes the pure light of the void, or held within the sort of the dreaming of the indigenous culture. And so the first point was that we are all part of something bigger than just ourselves. And that the second point was that we have the capacity, each of us, every human being, has a capacity to directly intuit or has a spark of connection to this. And that we come into we can't get it through anybody else. That comes through our own natural connection. And a lot of those traditions will say things like that, Buddha said that, please don't be a herdsman of other men's cows. and that Muhammad said that someone who hasn't realized his metaphysics is like a ass just carrying a load of books around the place, just weighing themselves down, you know. And that these other things, that we have to have our own direct connection to this. It's not just through the head. You know? An Indigenous man that I spent some time with in Australia, and he would say, he said that sometimes you'd be walking along in country and then you'd get this feeling of called the weemie in your belly, and that you'd be walking along and this feeling would start to come, this direct sense of like where you were meant to get water. And he knew where a turtle was and how to follow that turtle to find water. And then he started walking through country, and then the weemie opened up and it was like he was walking through himself. So there's this sense in some of this wider that our skin isn't as enclosed as it sometimes feels, that there is a wider participation with life. So the third point, so the first point, we're all connected to something bigger than ourselves. The second point, in these wisdom traditions, Huxley bringing them together. Second point, that we all have a spark and a way to get to that. The third one is that equally, as much as we have a desire to open, to our lives, to love, to come out of our bushels, to open into who we are, we equally have a movement of resistance. We equally have this no going on. So we have this opening and we have this resistance. And I sometimes use the metaphor for this of the butterfly, that even when the butterfly is emerging and starting to grow its new wings after it's been, as I said, in that protein-like soup, because it was a caterpillar before, as you know, and then it has to eat its own body, it literally eats its own body, enters this protein-like soup before it emerges as a butterfly. And as it's actually starting to grow its wings into the butterfly, the same cells that are growing the wings freak out and start kind of eating it to try and bring the contraction back. So there's this opening principle, and at the same time, there's something that wants to actually stay the same, not change. And so you have to keep going, because if you just stop, you'll get kind of stuck, in the cocoon, like with one wing down, or, And so you have to keep opening, and then the other cells will get on side of that movement of opening, and change can start to happen. So there's resistance. And the fourth one, this is quite a big one, what these traditions put forward, is it's the soul, one of the soul tasks of the human life is to realize this deeper homecoming, to find our deeper homecoming while we're here. And that this path, to this wider identity is spoken about very differently depending on the different culture that it landed in. And we see this even in the Buddhist traditions, in all the different traditions, that the path is spoken of quite distinctly depending on the culture where the Dharma landed, the people that were speaking about it. So there's these truths, but then the way they are expressed is so diverse. And I've always felt a great regard for that there's this depth, but the distinct way that it's expressed is so diverse. So that's just speaking a little bit more about this movement, this transcendental inheritance. And then we also have this in our life, this personal inheritance, this very distinct, that we have particular bloodlines in us, all of us, pretty different. A lot in Australia here and other places, we're quite a motley bunch, very diverse, different streams moving through us. We each, grow up in very different environments in our homes. We each reckon with in our psychological development places where we were really supported and given love, or then places where love was withheld. We've all had very different experiences that we've negotiated in our growing up. Inside of us, inside of just our personal self, we also have, what they're becoming even more alert to, these generational traumas. And it's said that, in my genes, the trauma of my grandmother can live. And some of us have certain illnesses, that we negotiate. Some of us have, some of us are born with very able bodies. Some of us are born with not so able bodies. Some of us are born with particular propensities to depression, to anxiety, or just to sort of ease. There's a lot of this in our personal inheritance, a lot of givenness that we don't choose. Yet we also, each of us will have very different personal preferences. Like you might like mango ice cream and I like chocolate ice cream. Or I'm drawn to want to study this sort of dance and you're drawn to want to study that kind of dance. You like jogging, I like swimming, that we all are very distinct in what we love. There's the richness of this in who we are. And all of us in the psychological development, it's said that each phase of our life, and the psychologist of you or psychotherapist will track this territory far more than me. I stumbled upon it just through my own practice and what I've had to address in myself. But we each have different psychological cracks, where, those early years from when we're 0 to 1, where it's all about safety and holding, and some of us got that very well and some of us didn't, and it has an impact on our body. Or those next years where there's, 2 to 4 different years where there's a sort of ego development when we're allowed to sort of rage, and the parent has to contain our rage, and it's me and I want this and I don't want that, and we're kind of growing somewhere in that, these developmental boundaries, and then it goes on from 4 to 5 and then 5 to 9 and on. And that there's certain phases in that where it's really helpful if certain things have been supported in us to grow a healthy ego. But of course, we live in a very, the grace and grit of this world, where sometimes there's a lot of holding, sometimes not a lot of holding. Again, that's very different for each of us. And we could say that all of these experiences that we've had, they live they're written in our bodies. It's in our bodies, in this collective, in our unconscious, and what the Buddha also calls like our layer, like the storehouse, is full of all these different experiences. And this, we could say, our uniqueness is the sort of fodder for us the compost, for us to come into relationship with, to grow our practice. Because I think we can kind of, feel in that too, in these different identities that, this happened to me and this happened to me, and I'm a woman, and I'm Jess, and da-da-da. There's something else in us that says, but that isn't all that defines me. I don't know if you've had that feeling, like that's not just all who I am, my conditioning. Yeah. And so one example I could just give of this that's sort of simple is, before I keep going, but is working with the theatre company of people with disabilities, and who were given the draw card of certain genetic particular interruptions in their system that deeply affect the life in the here and now. So I worked for quite some years with these individuals, and some of you have heard this story, but when I was doing a lot of one-on-one work and with one young, beautiful man who had Down syndrome, and him saying to me, one day, because we were doing a lot of spoken word and movement together, I said, Jess, I know I've got Down syndrome, and he said, and I know that's why I don't get the girl, in his very beautifully unique voice, I know that's why I don't get the girls that I love. I know that's why people look at me funny. And then you see the awareness, the intelligence in his clear seeing. I know people feel uncomfortable around me, he said. And and I was like, I hear you. And then I just said to him, but Cameron, that's not all who you are, is it? And he said, Jess, that is so not all who I am. That is not all who I am. And then this man, when he would start dancing, and you'd feel him sort of move through that sort of constraint and that limitation, that disability, he would start dancing, and it was like dancing with a Buddha, like the right kind of open gaze on him, the way he would start to move, the elegance, the way he could feel me, the sensitivity in him was just this shining Buddha. So again, not to sort of trivialize or romanticize like disability, which can really, really constrain a life, you know, it can constrain a life, but that's something deeper, something beyond just that presentation. And then something that we can feel, there's something more to me than just these different identities, part of that transcendent movement. So if we could say all of our experiences of the past are written in our own bodies, yeah, written in the life of our own bodies. And when we start to practice, when we start to sit, when we start to get quiet and we start to stop running and we start to give room for the life of the past to arise. And it's said that there's a whole lot of experiences in us that we couldn't deal with at a certain time in our life, you know, that were just too much. You know, there's certain experiences that we couldn't digest, that we had to wall off or we had to freeze out, you know. I mean, I just remember, this is a very light example, you know, I could give you a lot more heavy ones, but I won't right now, you know. But I remember this even as a girl sometimes, like climbing a tree and falling down off the tree and then standing up as if nothing had happened. And then it would be like 5 hours later, I'd realize, oh my God, I hurt myself. You know, sometimes we have these experiences and we don't even know the impact of them until later when the reverberations come out. It's something that what we do. It's not like when we're a young person, we have a kind of Buddhist or a Dharma understanding when someone is maybe laying some heavy shit on us, or we're up front of something in something quite shocking in life, that we can sort of say, oh, I understand that this person is just coming from ignorance and they don't exactly mean to be doing this, and that the way that this extreme sensation is landing on me is something impermanent, so I don't need to grip on, and I just move it through, I shake it out. You know, we don't grow up with that knowledge. It's simply that some things that happen are too much for us to bear, and we have to freeze it out, and we actually have to dissociate in order to get through that developmental sort of movement. We just have to bloody get through as we can and survive. And I think we do that astonishingly, you know, what we've all been able to manage in our life and to move through. But in that we form certain identities, you know, to sort of get by, like, well, I'm just the strong one, or I'm this one, or I'm that one. In order, we sort of limit our identity to kind of get through these coping strategies, we would say, to get through. Some of this is sort of, it's quite a lot of territory I'm talking about here. Are you all with me still? Okay, great, yeah. So we have to do what we get through. So when we think about like this word, that's another buzzword like mindfulness, about bypassing, yeah, we get spiritual bypassing, where we're overriding aspects of our humanness to get to some open state. And, you know, we see this in people, you know, maybe all dressed in white and swanning around with a big smile on their faces. And you look at them and you feel the incongruency. It's like, there's like a big smile over some shit happening here. You know, that something actually hasn't been felt and lived through. You know, and we see this now outrageously in the Catholic tradition with the abuse that's happened. And then there's this holier than now masculine authority presentation that is actually, you know, not dealt with, has radically bypassed and not dealt with a whole lot of perversity or you know, just experience that has not been attended to, that then leaks out and comes out in these really, you know, profound ways. So we see this bypassing. But then I was speaking to a friend, my friend in New York, who's, you know, holed up there right now, and he's a Zen practitioner and a psychotherapist. And he said to me, look, Jess, it's not even a question of who's bypassing, it's just how much are we bypassing, or how much are we not because we had to, you know? So it's, again, we can sort of say, oh, you better be, you know, don't spiritual bypass. We can put another sort of perfectionist trip on that, like you shouldn't bypass. But inevitably, we're all going to have had to at some point do that to get through. And then when we start to sit and we start to get into the body, which is the storehouse of so much, some of this material will start to arise. Some of this psychological material will start to arise, and to be embraced, to be included, and it will start knocking on our door. And that's where I think where some people, I don't know, where some people who don't do that work or tend to that, and then it goes into shadow, and then it comes out in very sort of misdirected, damaging ways, at some point not picking up on some piece there and are bypassing and overriding in a way that can provoke a lot of pain. They're not listening to their human needs, or So when this starts to knock on our door, this call for attention, sometimes a sitting practice, we can meet this terrain. Sometimes through sitting, and we're learning to be the mother or father of our experience again. And there's more fragile aspects of our experience start to be there, and we sit and we find we have the ground to meet them, and we can do these deep, nourishing practices, those lying down practices to grow our resource into a deeper place. And we can meet this. And sometimes it's too much on our own. Sometimes we actually really need to leave the cushion, and we need to talk to someone. We need to sort of flesh that out relationally. And so, and there are moments I know when I've had to go and engage in a conversation that there's some territory that we can't go through alone. That we need actually to walk hand in hand with someone else. Someone needs to take our hand through that territory, because the very nature of that pain is often that it happened in isolation, and so it needs that relational contact. And so another one of my teachers once said that, there's nothing like the experience of the unconditioned. So when we start to unstick or unbind from our identity, and we know ourselves as something deeper, so I can see that I'm not my thoughts that are moving through me, that this sadness that's moving through, I can welcome it. It's ultimately not me. It can come, it can go. We loosen up, and we have more space and more capacity to be with what moves through us. She says, when we touch what the Buddha calls the unconditioned, like the deep of us, then very quickly, it's like our unconscious, like something will scrape it, and a lot of other material will come to light, So we can think we've gone back. We would go, oh my God, I felt so much better before I started meditating because I'm all bound up and in control. I haven't opened this up. But as we get stronger, more of those fragments that Ken Wilber spoke about may come to light to be included. Is everybody still with me? Cool. Okay. So they'll come to light. We haven't done anything wrong. We've gone deeper, so more material will come. And this has very much been my experience. So the unconditioned will then bring out more for us to meet, more shadow for us to meet. And again, that time something we can handle on our own, and something we very much need to tease and unpack and talk to someone about. And so some of this it's interesting. So I'm sort of moving through this, and I really thank you for traveling with me through this territory as I'm finding my way. Something else that can happen in our meditation practice, where we sometimes have these experiences, where our sense of identity gets quite shaken, because past ways that we've known ourselves, say I know myself that I'm an independent person or I'm a strong person, and then this material is arising in me of like utter neediness and vulnerability, and that, that is threatening my fixed identity of being this strong person. So at first I'm not going to want to feel that, me, I'm needy. That is going to be offensive to my sort of heroic identity. And so we can be threatened, but that it's what's actually being threatened is the identity that feels that it only has to be this one way. And practice is opening us to be more of ourselves, more fluidly. Yeah. As we're asked to I'm saying the same thing again, but to bring in these more vulnerable aspects. So I may be strong, but oh God, I'm also vulnerable. And we start to see that in us is so many facets. And so something that can happen when we're in that feeling of loosening our identity, sometimes there's this words you may feel like the dissolution of identity, the dissolution of self, this is part of the road to waking up, where that fixed sense of self starts opening. And that can be quite disorientating in practice. Have any of you known that feeling of sort of disorientation? Can I just have some nods if you've known that? Yeah. Yes, like why not? Your identity is changing. You've known yourself as this. You're actually getting bigger as more material is coming into you. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like you're going back to some hairy territory. If you were in a monastery feeling that and you were getting confusion around your identity and it was starting to open up, because cracks like this will let that luminosity start coming through, something not controlled, something not contrived, will start to allow a more freer sense of being that will be disorientating. Because like the Buddha says, we're letting go of the place where we once stood to widen our identity. If you're in a monastery, everyone would cheer you on. They'd go, yay, you don't know who you are. You're getting some humility. You're going to be able to start opening and being receptive to life. They'd cheer you on. They would sort of nurse you through that process of disorientation as you're coming into this deeper integration beyond your conditioning. But here in the West, you're going through that dissolution and you're feeling shaky. You don't know who you are. It could be like, whoa, because we love like knowing who we are, having an egoic sense of ourselves, saying who we are. There's not always support for that. So that also sort of needs to be held. There's naturally moments where we're changing, that where we need support or we need some conversation. I've had to speak to my teachers about, am I going back? And they're like, no, this is good. You're going forward. Stay with it. And then more freedom can start to really come. What also can sometimes happen is sometimes when we start loosening the identity and we start, maybe having sometimes these experiences we could call of emptiness or of opening, is that can be quite a spiritual unbound experience. And some people have had that through a drug experience where something kind of unbounds in us and we feel incredibly open and free. Drugs have, some people, that's their entry point. And sometimes that openness can be very open, but sometimes that openness can also then quickly turn into some kind of dissociation, where in that openness, sometimes earlier aspects of our development, say early places of not being held or contained, can come into that openness. So a spiritual opening may again kind of rebirth psychological cracks, yeah? And that's something that won't be answered on the meditation cushion. So like a good teacher will start to be able to see, hey, you're opening here, or here you're going back into even maybe some pre-verbal territory of being unbound, and you need holding, and there needs grounding, and there needs support. So it's just interesting territory, this. You still with me as we're traveling through? Okay, yeah. So it's interesting territory. See, sometimes the waking up path will open into the psychological and something else needs attention. Yeah, so I've seen some people, you'll see in India, they're walking around like floating in this open space. It's like, whoa, you're actually looking very numb. You're numbing out right now. There's actually a dissociated experience happening, and you need to come back to the ground, come back to the body, come back to sort of, the everyday life. So it's interesting. It would sometimes happen, this sort of awakening and dissociation and freezing out would happen sometimes to a lot of monks when they were practicing. There were monks that would go up to the mountain, sort of hell-bent on these hard truths of transcendence, of sort of leaving things behind. And then these monks, it said, would get into these frozen states. And it's good, they would actually like sort of freeze in their sitting postures. So there would be places around in the mountains where there would be these monks that sort of entered this frozen place where they were cancelling out aspects of their experience, not including. And at one point, all of these women were sent up to the mountains to find these men. And they found these men and they brought them back from the mountaintop. And then these women started massaging these men and having to give this deep body work to these men, massaging them sort of back into their humanness. And it said these men that were in these frozen open spaces, but they got kind of stuck. And then the women would be massaging them. And then all of that human material, like the tears starting to come, oh, you know, I missed my mum, or this happened, or all this beautiful human material starting to come through their bodies in this healing, that these monks needed to kind of be massaged back out. Mm. So I think that there is a time where we're sitting with ourselves, and we are, you know, deepening into some quietude and learning to embrace the unlived life, you know, to catch up with ourselves. That can be part of the process, that the tears that weren't shed, that need to be shed, that come through, what's frozen starting to open as we become more fluid. And that's a beautiful process of the body unwinding and softening and meeting. And then certain aspects will come, and I'm just saying the same thing again another way, where we need that relationality. We actually need to speak to someone, that they need expression. You know, the grief that may move through us needs to be, you know, we need to speak to someone that needs that witnessing. It's like, yeah, like, I am so sad about this. You know, it's like all of the voices that we run from and sort of have this presentation of okayness, that there's some point where that needs to be spoken, you know, or I feel, you know, some part of me, I've just felt unlovable, or I felt betrayed, or I'm so sad, or I feel so hopeless, or I'm this, or I'm that, or I was so hurt by that. Like that unfreezing relationally can be so powerful. You know, one teacher sort of speaks that freeing the prisoners. We have to sit down and actually, when we sit there and we start to meet these these energies that once seemed like enemies, that once threatened us, and we lose our fear, and we get to know their nature, and we see what was once sort of scary is just these aspects of ourself that are yearning for our attention. And these aspects of ourself, if we don't address them, they'll keep in our practice, they'll yank us back down. We'll start growing, and then there'll be a call for attention. Another, I'm just checking the time. Yeah. Another interesting point that can be sometimes in the sitting, when we're sitting in a meditation practice, and sometimes, you know, and human beings to different degrees have experienced different levels of trauma. And just to go gently with this now, sometimes what trauma will do in our body is make us very alert, you know, hypervigilant. So we're practicing mindfulness in this very hypervigilant way. So we're mindfully kind of like watching what's going on. I'm mindfully moving my body. I'm noticing what I'm feeling. But there can be a lot of tension in that mindfulness, and that sitting with all of that tension also sometimes needs another approach. Then that might need some real, again, like body work and touch and massage to help that alertness soften, because mindfulness is not meant to be a sort of prisoner. It's not a prison guard, like watching our experience. That's not mindfulness. It's not an aggressive thing. Mindfulness is a very unjudgmental, soft noticing. And sometimes that can get hijacked by this more critical, sort of hyper alert watching. So it's like our mindfulness becomes this sort of almost overzealous tracker. You know, it's like, you could think mindfulness is like watching a butterfly. I'm watching this butterfly moving this way, and now I'm watching the butterfly moving that way, and now I'm watching it that way. But mindfulness is in service of connection, is to see the butterfly, to connect with the beauty of the butterfly. It's not like mindfulness, we're not just trying to carry our glasses well around the place. I know how to move my glass up. I know how to move my glass down. It's mindfulness in the service of also relaxation, to start to see what's happening inside, to be able to meet it. So when our mindfulness is ever becoming more like a sort of vigilant watcher, it's very useful to notice that. And again, sometimes this will come out in a one-on-one with a Dharma teacher. You know, one guy was talking to me about that, having this sort of tracking. He was always watching what was going on, and I was like, wow, you're like a tiger tracking But what would it be to be able to just let that go and sort of just feel safe, and to have your mindfulness sort of moving from more of a safe place? He was like, oh yeah, oh my gosh, yeah, exactly. So there's just these distinctions to be made. So yeah, it's just exploring this territory. Because I think it's a very beautiful part of practice. Yeah, it's a beautiful part of practice, as when things that we have maybe, and this is an Emerson quote, things that we have abandoned or not lived, they can, when we invite them back in, they can come back, as Emerson said, with a certain majesty that what we once alienated in ourselves will come back with a certain majesty, and that re-embracing aspects of our life, like that person walking along and tending to the different babies. It's very beautiful. Homecomings can happen within that. Okay, so I've sort of been talking about the need in practice that sometimes we can do things on our cushion, and sometimes there's something will arise and it needs relationality. So I think we've got clear on that, on that side. The limitations of a meditation practice at times could perpetuate a pathology even sometimes, and it needs another approach. It needs something else. And I think if we listen deep enough to ourselves, we'll take ourselves there. We know when something else needs attention. So that's some of the shortcomings of a meditation practice, yeah, where maybe sometimes there's trauma involved that needs like another care. It needs relationality, or there's other aspects in our developmental growth that need some support. Like we need to learn our boundaries. We don't need to soften our boundaries and become more unbound. Before we become more unbound, we have to actually know how to say no and go away, and that's not okay. And that's developmental growth, yeah? So there's that. But then what may also be the limitations of, say, a psychological approach that doesn't have the deeper Dharma? Sometimes we can be endlessly trying to fix ourselves, yeah? It's this like almost perfectionist thing of keeping on trying to fix ourselves. And we're just muddying up the pot. Yeah, we're not giving ourselves the opportunity to find our deeper ground in the foundations, to really get behind knowing what it is, to be able to be at ease, to relax, the practice and discipline to unhook from the mind and start to see from the Buddha generous view that the relationship to what's moving through us, to actually claim our freedom seat for a while. So that endless thing to fix it, and we could keep just perpetuating the same story and we get stuck, you know? And we keep collapsing into these old places where actually we need to stand up in them. So there's a difference between tending to something and then collapsing into it. And so that support that we could endlessly, the stories are going to be never ending. There's going to be perfectionists. We're never going to get totally right. We're never going to be totally purified, you know. There's things we need to tend to, but that it's not coming from this fix it. It's coming from this love of integration and bringing us into fullness. So that endlessly sort of fixing and like picking at the scratch. I mean, picking at the scratch, you can just keep doing it. And sometimes you just need to not go into the content. Just grow your freedom for a while. You know, do your practice, do your breath, get your roots, go for your walks in nature. Grow your freedom as much as you grow your relationship to your suffering. Because it will equip us then to meet what's there in a wise way. Because when we're deeply resourced, we have some wholeness, it's so much easier to embrace all that moves through us as a human being. So that sort of ego job of never-ending sort of fixing gets so tiring. I think that's where it gets kind of that navel gazing, you know, always in some kind of process. And there it just needs to come back to good ground, you know, to nature, to walking, to people, to getting really into that breath. I mean, so much practice to find that ground in the breath, to tunnel deeper into something. And the role, in a sense, of a Dharma teacher, say different to a psychotherapist, the role is to, we could say in a sense, like to keep gazing through the sometimes personal story into the depth of who we are, into the possibility. So it's the tenderness to meet right where we are, but to also not like just hold us there. The generosity of the Dharma gaze is wanting to give us space to keep growing further beyond what we know of ourselves. You know, so it's not pinning us down. So sometimes you'll get teachers that don't even care about the personal story. It's like they'll just laugh. It's like, oh, whatever, you know, it's just content. Just me to move it through. You know, they'll just say, like you'll listen to Goenkaji, he'll just say anicca, it's just changing, it's changing. You don't need to go into the content. You know, I think sometimes we deeply do know things. Really, we do need to go into the content. There needs some unpacking. We need to grow our own unique being. We need to tend to the wound, to where we're hurting. Both. So Dharma teachers can sometimes be quite, you know, in that sense, some of those wild ones can be sort of disruptive because they won't collude with us with our contraction, you know? It's like they won't just go, oh, we're not always empathetic in that sense because they're wanting us to see it, and there's some aligning to our depth. And no one is going to sort of, we are the only ones that can take our own depth and take our own seat in freedom. And sometimes there is some practice of just aligning with that and running with it and stretching out, and some trust of falling deeper into our practice to touch upon that really naturally healthy ground. And I think through that personal work, the more we embrace and we kind of go, whoa, you know, what I thought was out there in the world is actually in me. The terror I see out there, or the anger, or the envy, or the insecurity, we start to feel it in ourselves and make room for that. The world comes closer to us because we're not putting these boundaries around. And something that, you know, it's sometimes said that those wolves that once felt like they were hunting us down, if we treat them right, if we give them love, this is a poem from somewhere, that they will in the end be the dogs that will bring our slippers to us in the night. That's the things that we're scared of in ourselves. If we treat them right, once they may be the wolves that hunt us down, then later on they'll be the ones that will bring us our slippers in the night if we treat them right. And that the way we work with our own patterns, our own habits, where we're not just working for ourselves, because again, what's in me, you know, my suffering is connected to my generation, to my family, is connected to all of us. I almost feel when each of us is relating with something difficult, it's like taking one for the team. You know, our practice is not just for ourselves alone. So, quite a big topic, hey? Again, the deepening into the unconditioned, into the deeper ground, will bring forth sometimes our human material. And I'd say that it's also sometimes said that the more we kind of grow in our personhood, and the stronger we can kind of become, the more we can hold those openings of experience and integrate them. So it's like some people will have like an ayahuasca experience or a drug experience and really see something precious, but then not be able to integrate it in. So there is some growing up that we do practice that allows to stay open. We're getting some reverb. Someone's not on mute. Anyway,
Someone's not on mute. Anyway,
long talk.
Long talk. Hey.
So we had Huxley's 4 things here, those 4 components in the transcendent path that, if you remember, I would add a 5th one that whilst it's sort of we could say that it's something in us to actualize, you know, our sovereign depth, our goodness in our life, our ground, our resourcefulness, our sovereignty to connection, that then it is also our opportunity to express it, the 5th one, that each of us to, in whatever way, to express our deeper life through our own means, you know, the way we pour our intelligence or our heart into life. So we can have these deep insights, but they're really tested in the way we live. Okay, that felt a little, that was quite a talk, hey? These 2 tracks, the personal track and the transcendent track, and this willingness to weave them 2 together. So there's a lot of components in there that could be fleshed out more distinctly. And this was my first big sort of overall sketch. Yeah, start to see, you know, what we need, what needs attention, and what's really going to meet it, and what's really going to answer something for us. Is it on the cushion or is it off the cushion? Put it in that pithy way. And the power of doing that hard work, sometimes that healing work of embracing forgotten parts, I mean, that can be hard, you know, when things arise. But the beauty of that, how that's enlarging in us and growing our humanity, to be able to know that all of us sit in the totality of our humanity, you know. We get more comfy in something in ourselves, we get more comfy in the other, it's less threatening. We're not projecting it all out there in some other out there. And the same way that and I think that the meta, our inner life really calls for our love. And the inner life can be a scary place when there's no love around. And the outer life can be a scary place when there's no love around. So we work it inner and outer. Okay, boom. That's the end of that long talk. Yeah. That's what I think we see in some of those teachers that are really falling, is that they've had these big awakenings that are genuine. Like, I've learned so much from these awake beings, but in other aspects, I look and I'm like, oh my God, you know, I've had to really, and it doesn't negate what they've given me, but I look at other areas and I'm like, whoa, you know, that needs attention. That growing up aspect doesn't mean I don't bow down to the waking up, but I go, whoa, you know, that needs some attention. That is causing harm. And we need to hold each other accountable in that. You know, like some teachers, you go, whoa, whoa, yeah. We all need to keep speaking up. But also not to, you know, diminish the fruits of that wild waking up and that invitation to that waking up. All right, okay, I'm going to stop now because I can feel I just keep on going, trying to flesh it out more. Okay, so that was pretty long, wasn't it? So our time now. What's our time? It is 3:53. Are we finishing at 4:30?